Welcome to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey of KIS Organics. This is the podcast where we discuss the cutting edge of growing from a science-based perspective and draw on top experts from around the industry to share their wisdom and knowledge. My guest this week is Rob Knechtel, founder of Black Swallow Living Soils. Although Rob's lifelong interest in growing cannabis began in the late 60s, he has spent the past 45 years in a completely unrelated industry designing, installing, and marketing fireplaces. When the Canadian government announced approximately 5 years ago that they would be legalizing cannabis production, Rob, his wife Lou, and son Nathan decided to start up Black Swallow Living Soil. Nathan runs the day-to-day operations with his team, and Rob, along with his wife, continue to concentrate on further building the Black Swallow brand. After meeting on a visit to Gold Leaf Gardens a few years ago, Rob and Nathan began to work on a couple projects with KIS Organics and now blend the KIS mix based off of my formulation. In a relatively short time, Black Swallow Living Soil has gained significant recognition as a respected supplier of organic soil amendments and growing supplies in Canada, which they ship coast to coast. In this podcast, we discuss exactly what goes into formulating a soil mix, as well as some of the challenges we see on a daily basis in this industry. Now on to the show. Hey Rob, thanks for coming on the show today.
Great, Tad. Excited to be here.
Yeah, so you are the owner of Black Swallow Living Soils up in Canada. Can you talk to listeners a little bit about yourself, a little bit about the history of the company, where you're located in Canada, some of those questions?
Sure. So located first in southern Ontario, in Brantford, which is a number of your listeners will know is the home of Wayne Gretzky. But also part of a pretty serious agricultural area. And Black Swallow came out of conversations between myself and my son Nathan, who runs the business with me. And this is prior to Trudeau's announcement that Canada was going to be embracing legalization. And we saw the opportunity to get an amendment input supply company up and running, and started to put the program together at that point in time. And of course, the first bit was pretty lean, but since that time, the business has grown considerably.
So you started in 2015. You had some other experience in running businesses in other markets. Do you want to just touch on that a little bit? Yeah,
Black Swallow is really our second business, if you will. We have over 40 years experience in a completely unrelated industry, the fireplace industry, where we do some OEM manufacturing for some of the fireplace manufacturers and whatnot. That also gave us pretty good experience in terms of moving products around, globally as well as North America. So that helped out when we wanted to get Black Swallow up and running, because probably the single biggest challenge that we faced initially was just trying to find the Canadian sources for our products. Pulling products out of the United States just alone because of the Canadian dollar difference, but also because of the border and shipping and all this sort of thing. Is not ideal. We had to find Canadian-sourced products, and that took a tremendous amount of time and energy in the initial early stages. But our ability to move products and know how to do that certainly played to our advantage in those days, and as well as on moving forward in business.
Yeah, I think that logistics thing is huge, because it's something that we still struggle with. It's the biggest headache that we have is dealing with logistics, especially right now with COVID going on. But your ability to move things across borders, I think, is a huge advantage for you guys in your business. One thing I want to touch on is you offer a lot of the same or similar types of organic amendments as what we carry here in the United States with KIS Organics. You're shipping them all over Canada. You guys are also the distributors, Canadian distributors for Fertile Pots. I've had William on the podcast with Fertile Pots. Those are the biodegradable pots. You guys work with Grassroots Pots. You carry and stock Blue Mat supplies for people up in Canada. And you also make soils, which is one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the podcast today, was to talk about soils. So you and I started working together, 3 or 4 years ago now. I met you when you guys came down. You toured Goldleaf. Went to a few other facilities. We got to have lunch. It was a fun day to get to meet you guys in person. You take me through a little bit of your soil formulation process, because the main point of this podcast will be to talk about soil formulation and then the process you and I went to. But let's go a little bit before that, because I know you were making other soils as well. Can we start there?
Yeah, I mean, that too was a bloody nose experience. You inevitably run up against the wall a few times in terms of trying to develop the best recipe that you can. I mean, I had decades of experience, sort of my own personal growing experience, thought that I understood soils and plant needs and soil science, and very quickly realized that what I knew was miles away from what current soil science, where it is today. Spent an awful lot of time reading and studying and taking courses and whatnot, and started off with a formula that would be, or is frequently referred to as a Clackamas Coot. I mean, Clack came out with a recipe that had a lot of mileage, and tried variations on that theme, and went through the process of doing the soil analysis from batch to batch and trying to gently tweak the recipe forward. Thought that we had a reasonable product, did have a reasonable product, but then after meeting yourself and being able to talk to someone who had considerably greater depth of experience with blending soils, learned quite a bit, and you were quite instrumental in working with us to develop our version of what we have called, in recognition of your input, the KIS mix. Now, when I say our version, that means that I'm taking into consideration the fact that we have considerable different geographical availability of products, and it makes no sense trying to duplicate when certain products that you would use in your mix are not necessarily available here in Southern Ontario, and vice versa. So, for instance, rock dusts, because of the proximity to the Canadian Shield, we have some pretty interesting rock dusts in Ontario that we had ready access to. Whereas things like pumice, which is apparently quite readily available in your backyard, we have to bring that in by the truckload, either from the States or from BC. So as an aeration contribution, it's what I refer to as sort of a luxury amendment because of the shipping costs and whatnot, and it's just not practical to use something like that in a standard mix. So we had to work with pricing and availability and do the vetting of the various different inputs that we have to ensure that we got the best bang for the buck. And the current KIS mix has been on the market now for 4 years or so, 3 to 4 years, and has proven to be very successful for us. It's been quite a pleasure to work with.
Yeah, so just going back, I do want to touch on the Coots mix. I know a lot of people have had really good success with it. There's certainly nothing wrong with that recipe. One thing I would like to highlight in regards to that is that Coot himself has always said you're not growing in Coots mix if you're not using his earthworm castings, which obviously are not available commercially. And that makes a big difference too in terms of the overall quality and finished product. So I just want to throw that out there for folks. And then also that, we started talking about formulation. I know you were working with another agronomist there and had a mix, but you weren't completely satisfied with it. And then you and I talked about collaborating on something, and this was 3 or 4 years ago now. And I kind of wanted to talk about that process for people, because there's a lot of people that make their own soils. And I think understanding what we went through to formulate this soil together, I think might be a useful exercise. So the first thing you mentioned was sourcing products. So looking at the sustainability and availability of these products, which I think is really, really important. So, things like things like pumice that aren't as locally available, we had to say, okay, well, what other products could we use in this case? We may want to use pumice, but it's not sustainable. The cost of freight is too high. It's going to raise the cost of the soil more than the value that the pumice was providing. Do you want to kind of talk through some of the inputs in that regard? You introduced me to some new rock dust I had never heard of that I had to research. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean that was a steep ladder to climb. We didn't want to just buy from where products were available through some distributors. We didn't want to just buy from the distributors. I mean, to make black swallow work, we knew that we had to buy from the sources, the producers of these various amendments, wherever and whenever possible. And that involved a fair amount of vetting of various different suppliers. And I actually traveled to a couple different provinces on a number of different occasions to visit different facilities to see what they had to offer to be able to weigh one producer against another. It also meant taking samples of these products and having them lab tested and whatnot in some cases to test for heavy metals and that sort of thing. I think one of the other big challenges that we were up against was, I know when we were out there on the West Coast, I was gobsmacked at the difference in cultural awareness between organic benefits, for lack of a better term. I remember going into a grocery store not too far from you, and where here in Ontario you would have a regular grocery store, you'd have a small corner of the grocery store that would be selling organic foods and whatnot. It seemed to be just the complete reverse, that the entire grocery store was filled with organic products. That was the norm, and it seemed as if there was a tiny corner where regular non-organic foods were sold. I know I'm exaggerating to some extent, but it just seemed to be that obvious. So, I mean, even trying to find a quality supplier of, you mentioned worm castings that Clack produces, and he certainly is a master of worm casting production. Very, very difficult in Ontario. There really is only one casting supplier that can produce any sort of volume. It's really done as a byproduct, or it had been done until only very recently as a byproduct of their bait worm industry. They have since turned that around and are committed now to quality casting production and are doing a good job of it. But there's only really one game in the province. Compost, I visited numerous different farms and talked to numerous different suppliers of compost in an effort to track down as high a quality of compost as I knew we wanted to have and should have. Talking to suppliers of kelp products, talking to some of the fish factories about their crab meal supplies and whatnot. It took a lot of vetting and a lot of research to get to the point where we are. I'm kind of glad those days are over.
Oh man, I hear you. I remember starting KIS with the idea because of, well, two things. One, I wanted to be able to make soil at home, and I didn't need a 50-pound bag of kelp meal or neem cake or whatever particular input it was. I wanted like 3 pounds because I was only growing a few plants at the time. And I saw this sort of like need in the industry at that point in time. And now there's multiple companies doing what we're doing. And you're kind of doing that now up in Canada. There aren't a lot of amendment suppliers at the moment, but I'm sure there's more on their way. But it's a lot of work to get something like this up and running, and your logistics background, I think, helped a lot. You did touch on a couple things that I wanted to talk a little bit more in depth on. One of which was the sourcing of the compost. And when it comes to formulating soils, I really think, at least with potting soils, living soils, that's where you need to start, is with your compost or your worm castings, because you're really formulating around that. That's the product that's going to determine how much of these other inputs you're going to put into the soil. So the highest quality source you can get and afford, I recommend that to people as their starting point. And you also touched on heavy metals. One of the things that I asked you for was the heavy metal analysis of all these products, especially the compost and the rock dusts, as anything mined as a potential source of heavy metals, because you guys do heavy metal testing up in Canada, just like we do in most states. So
yes, yep. No, I mean those are all very, very real concerns. Again, I know for a fact that heavy metal awareness in your marketplace is much more common than it is here in large parts of Canada, but it's inevitable that it's coming, and we want to be able to answer the questions when they're asked of us, and I have already done the homework to ensure that we have no concerns there. Products that with compost, as you well know, there are unfortunately a lot of people who look at compost as simply a broken down organic material. Others look at it strictly from its ability to supplement the fertility needs of the crop, and they look at it strictly from a nutritional analysis point of view. But with the game that we're playing here, it's the biology contribution as well that is, if not even more critical, that needs to be in place, and that's a lot of boxes to have to check off when the industry is really only emerging. We're still in the very early game here, and we're working with a couple of compost producers, for instance, that recognize this and are working really hard to get their product up and running, and have done a great job of moving their game forward. But it's a lot of conversations along the way.
Yeah, and in terms of actionable information for users, when I started working with Rob on this, having already formulated the mix that we use here in the United States, which took me probably 5 or 6 years to really nail down. This process with Rob took 2 to 3 years. I think we could have done it faster, but both running businesses and everything else that takes time. But there is a period of time that goes into researching and going through this. And so starting off with a base mix, we were looking at peat moss, perlite, only because of its ability to source and cost versus other aeration amendments. And then in this case, 3 types of compost. You had access to a nice fish compost, a leaf compost, which I really like. I don't have a good source of that here in Washington State, and then some worm casting. So between the peat and the 3 compost sources, that's really where we're getting the biological aspect of our soil. Because when I'm thinking of formulating soils, I'm looking at 3 things. I'm looking at the physical properties of the soil, and that's going to be how well does it drain, what's its CEC, how well does it hold nutrients, what's its water saturation capacity, those sorts of aspects of a mix. And then when I want to think about the biological aspects, what kind of microbiology we're going to have here, because that's what's going to cycle the nutrients, and that's where having a few different diverse sources is going to help. And then also sources that are, high in microbiology, because I think I had you send me samples and I looked at them under the microscope. I can't remember. And then you also had some that had some lab testing, so I was able to at least see some numbers on that side of things. And then ultimately, the last sort of pillar is sort of the chemical properties or the mineral content of these different things. So once I had all of that, then we could start thinking about what other things we wanted to add into the soil mix.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. That structure is probably deservedly the number one position in terms of that list of qualities you want to develop. And that our original mixes that we started out with for aeration, we were using rice hulls, and thought that was a pretty reasonable aeration option for us, and had the benefits of the broken down into silica content and whatnot. But we learned after some struggles that rice hulls, although not bad, that it not perfectly mixed into that mix, blended in, then it would tend to direct water into certain channels within the soil itself, and it would leave some dry pockets, and that created some issues. So it really was that trial and error process of having to look at whatever we were attempting to do with as objective a lens as possible, and in the end decided that perlite really was going to be the superior aeration offering, given the range of options before us. And same with the compost. We've since that time we've now got an addition of a horse compost to our mix that I love. The guy that makes that compost that we discovered not too long ago just absolutely lives, breathes, and eats compost making. He was studying under Elaine Ingham 12, 14 years ago, and he makes a tremendous product with all the inputs from his own farm and whatnot. So it really is a trial and error process at that level.
Yeah, I know a lot of people will go a third, a third, a third. So like a third peat, a third compost, and a third aeration. I tend to lean towards closer to 20% on the compost, and I still go about 33, 34% of some sort of aeration amendment. And then the rest of that is typically peat moss in the mixes that I like. And I like that mix for its ability to retain water and have good aeration. But, a lot of people I know successfully grow with that third ratio. So that's sort of your starting base mix part. And then on top of that, we start adding, these other amendments. And I remember the first time I sent you a recipe, you were shocked because it was so much more than anyone else had recommended putting into a soil mix. Can you talk about a little of your experience there?
Yeah, it definitely was more than our recipes that we were using at the time. But we certainly gave it a try, and the proof was there. So I think today our mix has 19 different amendments into it. We do go, I think, a little heavier on the rock dust contribution than you do, again, because it is something that we have ready access to, and the prices are reasonable, and so why not? But the complexity of the product, I think, just enhances its performance. The structure of the product is lovely. I mean, most people who are jumping into growing in soil for the first time struggle a bit with being able to get their soil to the proper moisture level. We add yucca to assist in that as a surfactant. But it does take a little bit of work to get the moisture levels, rehydrate the soil to the ideal level that the grower wants to use. But that is simply that just takes patience. Smaller doses of watering with a bit of time in between to allow it to get absorbed, and then the next watering is much more efficient in terms of penetrating that material. But once you've gotten that understanding of how to maintain the moisture levels that you feel your plants require, then it becomes a pretty painless process, especially if you're using something like blue mats to help in that irrigation process.
Yeah, you brought up a good point regarding moisture content. So optimally with these soils, we want to keep the moisture fairly even in there. We want to avoid these wet-dry cycles. And peat moss is naturally very hydrophobic. So when you mix the soils there on the facility, can you talk a little bit about that process in terms of the watering component and sort of that heating and cooling, that almost thermal composting process from all the nutrients that we're adding?
Well, I mean, again, that too was its own steep learning curve. We started off bought the soil mixer and started to learn how to add the materials to that soil mixer itself, which was very limiting in terms of the quantities of materials that we could produce at any particular time. But even handling when you poured in some of the dry ingredients, and then when you added the compost, and when you added everything else was problematic. We shut the machine down so many times and had to dig the material out because it balled up on us or just slogged down the machine. We've since moved on from a soil mixing system to our current method of blending the soils together, and that's also allowed us to do a much larger quantity at a single time, which has helped keep up with the demand. I think that here in Ontario, although we're on a similar sort of level with yourselves latitudinally, I guess that is, but I think our winters are a little more intense, and we have a big problem with this time of year in the freeze, so we have to make as much soil as we possibly can in the fall to guide us through the winter, because everything freezes on us. We don't have enough indoor space to be able to store vast quantities of soil. So we make up all our soils, we leave it outside, leave it exposed to the elements, tote it up, and find that we have to bring those frozen totes in and thaw them out before we can start packaging up that material or shipping it out. So it was a bit of a juggle trying to learn how to manage the soil production as it was increasing relative to the time of year. We managed to squeak by last year. I think that we'll make it through this winter here to hit spring running. And we know that as soon as it gets mild enough and the product's thawed, that we'll be right back out there mixing soil again.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to highlight for people making soils themselves is that if you do add a large amount of nutrients when mixing the soil, or these amendments, that the microbes in your soil are going to start breaking them down. The bacteria and archaea are going to reproduce quite rapidly, causing the soil to heat up. It's an exothermic reaction. So you don't want to plant into it right away. They actually, you want the nutrients to begin cycling. And so you'll go through this period where you mix everything, and 2-3 days later, the soil starts to heat up. You want to keep that moisture content ideal, lots of access to oxygen. If it gets above 131 degrees, you'll kill off any weed seeds that you had in the mix. Oh, this is Fahrenheit. I realize I'm talking to a Canadian. I don't know the conversion for that, but if you get above 131 Fahrenheit, it'll kill off all the pathogens and weed seeds in your mix. Keep it below 160 to keep all the beneficials alive, and treat it like you would almost a compost pile. So you would turn it, it would heat up again, and then over the period of the next week or so, given enough access to oxygen and the right moisture, that soil will sort of stabilize back at ambient air temperature, and at that point, you're ready to plant. And some people try and skip this step, or I've had guys put their soil into Rubbermaid totes with no holes, and then it turns into this like stinky, smelly mess.
Oh yeah.
So just something I wanted to highlight.
This is referred to as the cooking process, I think, is the common term that people like to use, and it is. You're absolutely right. It is an absolutely critical step. It is relative, I think, to the quantities that you're making. I mean, for a guy who's got 4 or 5 gallon pots and he's mixing together 20 gallons of soil, he's not going to get that temperature spike in the steaming pile that the guy who's making a couple of yards or a driveway full of soil is going to achieve.
That's a really good point.
I mean, you do have to factor, especially if you're going to be planting directly into this material with your clones or starts. You do not want to make the mistake of having too hot a soil, because the plants just won't survive in that. And you want, plus, as you stated, you've got the advantage of that biology that is already changed much of the nutrition, the available nutrition that's locked into that soil mix, into a more plant-available, bioavailable form. And I think that's, I was reading an article that John Kemp had written once, and he pointed out that, that's really what happens in our spring when the weather gets warm again and things start growing, and you get that incredible flush of green growth that we're all familiar with. A large part of that is directly attributable to the fact that over the depth of that winter, the winter months, the biology has kept on working. It's been making the transformation of the soil into that bioavailable form that as soon as it gets warm again and the seeds begin to sprout, that the plant can take this tremendous advantage of and has great nutritional resources for that spring flush. So that's what's happening in your soil as you're mixing it up too. You're trying to duplicate that, of course.
Yeah, I think recognizing temperature as a factor is important too. If it's really cold out, things are going to go slower than if it's really hot. They're not going to reproduce as quickly. So that's something to consider. And then also, in that smaller pot, let's say, like you mentioned, that in that first situation, while it may not heat up, it's still going to take a little while to nutrient cycle. And so even after mixing, I still like to wait a week or so, even in the smaller containers before planting. And frankly, seedlings, rooted clones don't need that much nutrition initially when they're first getting started. So I think people sometimes overdo it right at the beginning and slow things down a little bit in terms of plant growth. You can definitely use a lighter mix until the plant's really got some established roots.
People ask us if we've got a good seed start mix, and of course we just tell them no. Just take a little, take 50% of the KIS mix and 50% peat and dilute it accordingly, blend it together, and that gives you a pretty good balance for most seed starts. Because you're absolutely right, they don't need. In fact, a lot of nutrition at that front end can work negatively. So you do want to modify that to some extent. The other question that we get asked a lot is, I'm not ready to use my soil right away. How do I store it? And people think that if they have to leave the soil for months at a time before they're gonna plant into it, will the soil deteriorate? Will it lose its viability? Which of course it does not do. But just simply storing the soil, people say, well, is it okay if we store it in our basement or in our garage and whatnot? And we point out to them, no. Ideally, what you want to do is keep it outside, keep it in the elements, keep it where at least it's going to get the moisture from the rains and whatnot. You don't want it someplace where it's underneath a downspout sort of thing, where it's getting all the nutrients flushed out of it. But the rain and the snow and whatnot is actually good for that soil. It's not going to be a negative impact on it.
Yeah, I always tell people in terms of storage is to treat the soil like it has a plant in it all the time. If you do that, you're maintaining the moisture content where it needs to be, and that soil is going to stay more fertile. I do warn people to avoid, leaching of nutrients if they want that soil to maintain the same fertility, because certain things are going to leach out quicker than others. Nitrogen and potassium are the two main ones. Sodium will leach out, which is a good thing in most cases. But that's why, for example, if you get a standard soil test, it's not going to give you your field soil. It's not going to give you a nitrogen recommendation on there, because it's going to assume that, especially here in the Pacific Northwest, that rain has leached all the available nitrogen or nitrates out of the soil, and you really need to add those in the spring. So that's just one caution I would have for people is if you're going to store your soil and it is getting leached, do plan on adding at least some of those more mobile cations back into the soil prior to planting. Right. And, I like to throw, a compost tea or a handful of alfalfa meal, just something, maybe a diluted molasses water rinse, just something to get the biology up and active again, a week or two prior to I plan on using it. But you're right. The majority of the nutrients are staying put. The soil stores just fine. It does great in nature. These microbes are very resilient, whether they insist or go dormant. They're surviving the process too. They've adapted to a lot of the conditions that you described. So don't throw away your soil. What
about in your market area? I've seen references to vegan-only soil mixes where some people are quite concerned about ethically the ethical versus the pragmatic amendment usage. So, I mean, obviously someone who is concerned about that sort of thing is going to be reluctant to perhaps use blood, bone, and feather meal in their soil mixes. Is that a huge, a significant aspect of your market demand?
You know, it hasn't been. I am currently, as of like last week, talking to one facility in Oklahoma that wants to move towards a veganic or vegan soil mix. And I said, that's absolutely something I'd be happy to help you with. So we're talking about that right now. It is a thing. There are a lot of people that believe in growing using vegan inputs. And frankly, I don't have a strong opinion either way. I'm not personally a vegan, but I respect people that are, and that life choice. There's certain things that are and are not allowed in vegan production, and that list sometimes gets a little murky in the sense that some vegans are okay, I think, with the use of insect poop.
Sure.
But other people are not. Earthworm casting seemed to be okay. And, you know, again, that's a manure product. If it were me, where I would draw the line, if I really wanted to take a stand on this, I would look at our industrial food chain and say, I don't want to use anything that comes from slaughterhouses or from our fisheries. That to me is a more sustainable approach to this, but you could absolutely formulate around these challenges. It's just going to raise the cost in some cases, because you still need all your major, micro and macronutrients. The plant still needs these elements. So where are you getting them? Well, most vegan sources are quite low in some of these specific things. So they're a little harder to track down. It's really easy to get nitrogen and phosphorus from some of these animal-based products. But
well, it is, and I'm again, I don't want to be perceived making the argument one way or the other, but I also am aware that, I mean, if we can't use these waste products, the bone meal, the feather meal, for instance, tremendous amount of feather meal from our poultry industries and the blood meal and whatnot, then the only other real alternative is it just becomes landfill, I guess, at some level. So if we can take those products and turn them into our soil, let the biology work on them and transform them into vital plant growth substances, then I think that needs to be factored into some of these discussions too at times.
Yeah, I mean, technically, vegans won't use honey in a lot of cases, or consume honey, because that's the manipulation or exploitation of honeybees. Something that we formed a symbiotic relationship with, one could argue, in terms of species to species. So, it is what it is. But
Yep.
That is an interesting question. I do have a blog post that lists a bunch of vegan inputs for people that want to make a vegan soil. That would be a good starting point on our blog page. And I'm working on a new mix right now here in the U.S. that would be more sustainable using, I've cut out a lot of those major inputs, trying to consider these things as something for growers too. So It's a good question.
Right.
Yeah. Well, let's see here. I'm looking through the list of questions that I have from you that we've talked about already. Did you want to touch at all on this idea of water only? I know that's something that I think you get asked a lot. Do you consider these soils water only? How are growers using the soil mix in most of the situations and the growers that you work with?
Well, yeah, water only is a term that I get hung up on a little bit at times, and yet I use it all the time. I mean, water only implies that the soil has the ideal blend of all the various different nutrients that the plant is going to need from sprout to harvest in the balance and the ratios and the ideal ratios that it's going to require, irrelevant or completely independent of the genetic needs of that particular plant. And that's a huge demand to put upon any soil mix. I mean, it just won't do that. Water only, I think, comes into play for people who are starting out on their first living soil journey. They can grow a very decent harvest by just simply maintaining the proper moisture level of their soil and giving their plant the water that it requires, and they'll do very well with that. But there are also plenty of growers who have gotten beyond that, who are quite capable of, that they understand perhaps the particular genetics that they're growing and the nutritional demands that particular strain or variety might enhance its growth, and they're capable of adding the extra teas, the maybe top dressings at the right stage of the plant growth and that sort of thing, to further tweak that plant expression. So I just think that sometimes water only it needs that extra context of that term, that it's great as a sort of an overall approach, but that's not to say that you can't move beyond that and be more target specific in your growing habits, and that just comes from a experienced gardener's approach.
Yeah, I know when I first started with this, what's now called Living Soils, I was going for something with the idea being that if you were a medical or cancer patient, you could walk into a grow store and get a bag of soil and walk out and just water your plant. So it's really more about simplicity rather than maybe what's optimal. And now that we're talking about people using it in facilities, commercially, looking at more sophisticated ways, I do think small inputs that are targeted at stages of growth can increase your overall yield and fertility. So I would totally agree with that. But yeah, for me, water only started because of sort of that concept more so than necessarily maximizing yield or health.
Right.
But you can go water and still get a good looking
Absolutely.
plant. So that's not off the table if that's the level of horticulture that you're comfortable with.
I mean, we mentioned Clax mix, but there are other mix. I mean, you Google soil recipes, and there are thousands of them on the internet, just slight variations of similar themes. But there are a number of recipes out there too that took sort of the opposite approach, where they tried to throw absolutely everything at their soil. And it was sort of what I call the kitchen sink approach. And we spoke a moment ago about the complexity of the KIS mix by comparison. But I think in the earlier days of soil recipes, soil making, they were trying to throw everything at that soil with the attitude that the more the better. And I think that, fortunately today we've got an understanding of where that happy medium space is, where you do have some sort of disciplined approach to your nutritional profile that you're building in that soil, and just letting that work its magic.
Yeah, I want to caution folks in the idea that, yes, you can put a lot into the soil, but it needs to be balanced. So, and it needs to be balanced around your compost sources. So when you see these recipes online, and I've seen thousands by now in all these forums, what they're not taking into account is that you're probably not using the exact same compost sources, and that really throws off the mix, because that's what you're formulating around, and I think people need to be aware of that. So it's not just about any recipe, it's about, it needs to be formulated around what you have and what you're using on that end. So there's that I wanted to touch on, but I think in terms of complexity, it's really all about balance. So one of the things we haven't talked about yet is when we first mix the soil, you send off samples for lab testing. We got those back, and then we just started tweaking. So I'd have you make some adjustments. You would take that mix it up again, send those off to the lab. And it took quite a few tests before we got to a point where I was like, hey, this looks right. Now let's start doing plant trials. So the first thing is the mixing. The next thing is the testing until you feel like you've hit that balance. You like the numbers. And then you get into plant trials at that point. So it was a process, you know. And it costs some money too to get, you don't hit it right off the bat. You know, I think with some experience and having formulated a lot of soils, it allowed us to start a little bit closer maybe to our goal, but you know, you're not going to nail it on your first mix.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And of course, I mean, that also, you can point to the value of, for some of the larger producers of sap testing and tissue testing that allows them to still analyze the fertility needs of their plants. Generally, that tends to be well, both indoors and outdoor field-grown products, but there are still tools that you can move forward from even that point, and really dial in your plant's requirements if that's the path that you really want to go down.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you mention the sap testing and the tissue testing and things like that, part of dialing that in allows us to add nutrients, you know, mid-cycle and make improvements. But this is also our best guess for a variety of cultivars that all fall under the, you know, the classification of cannabis. So, you know, different strains or cultivars are going to pull up nutrients at different rates, and that's something that needs to be factored in as well. You know, some call them heavy feeders versus light feeders. Some people say some plants are more sensitive, but ultimately we have a pretty big genetic variety that falls under the canopy of cannabis. And so no mix is going to be perfect for all of them. And that's where you can sort of start with a really good premium soil and then sort of tweak it based on the mix that you're growing. And then also realizing that they're going to pull different levels of nutrients out of each soil mix too. So absolutely.
So when it comes time to, you know, in between cycles to re-amend, you want to have a pretty good idea of what the proper approach to rebalancing that soil again is going to look like.
Yeah, and that's something else, you know, you and I have worked on a nutrient pack as well for Canada too, so that people can not only mix their own soil if they're not able to have it shipped due to shipping cost for the, you know, the peat and the perlite and all those things, but also when they go to re-amend the soil, this is sort of our best guess based on the average plant. But if you get a soil test, you could custom or dial in that even further in a lot of cases.
Yeah, the re-amendment, I mean, the expense of shipping soils across Canada just, you know, is hard to justify in some scenarios, and the re-amendment pack was a good solution to get the core materials out there and let people, you know, use the compost and the peat and the perlite or the aeration ingredient that they can find in their own backyards. But yeah, that creates a pretty serious starting point. But then doing further soil analysis and trying to modify that mix according to what that analysis tells you out of a good lab where you're getting the proper results is very valuable.
Yeah, and you have to stay with the same lab because you can't really compare these test results across different labs and make good decisions. So we use Logan. I know they're really popular. Kind of most of the industry has gone to them. They got lucky in that regard. But, you know, when I see a Logan test now, I can look at it really quickly and at a glance see what the limiting factor of growth is most likely in that soil mix. And that's an advantage of using the same lab over and over again.
Yes, and so we, you know, between you and I, we kind of also had you look at A&L labs. We tend to use A&L labs here in Ontario, which they have a Western office as well too. But it took a little bit of review on your part to compare that to a Logan lab analysis, just to calibrate the two, so that you could feel confident about what A&L labs results were telling you. As we both know, every lab result is every lab that you're using is going to provide slightly different test results, and Logan's has become sort of the standard go-to in the U.S. Up until just the beginning of this year, we had no problem sending soil samples down to Logan Labs in Ohio. They had on their website a PDF that allowed you to print off the documents and accompany your shipment, and it went across no problem. But I was talking to them there a week and a half ago, and apparently the Department of Agriculture has come out with completely different requirements for moving products across the border now, and it's not anywhere near as easy as it used to be.
I wasn't aware of that. That's good to know. That's unfortunate. Well, I mean, ultimately, there's nothing, I guess, special in the sense that there are a lot of labs running the same test, but you need to know what test they're running. In the case of Logan, we're looking at a malic 3 and a saturated paste. And then you just need to make sure that it's you're looking, understand the complexity of the particular methodology or soil test that they're running, and then you stay with the same one over and over again so you can correlate results across different samples. Yeah. So that's the key point there. It doesn't have to be Logan.
Consistency is critical.
Yeah, and then I know you and I are talking, you were able to find a way to essentially prill material in terms of a nutrient pack, which I was pretty excited to hear. And I mean, I'm open to saying on air what we're working on right now in those regards. Yeah,
the prilling it's just a convenience factor for the end user. Plus, it also greatly cuts down the dust that can come from just blending up a bunch of different materials and throwing it into a bag. So prilling is just adding a lignin as a binder that turns it into a consistent texture, and it makes handling the product very, very safe and sensible. And that made a big difference in terms of our amendment product as we got our first prilled batch back.
Yeah, I'm wishing I could do that down here. I haven't had a good source that's willing to work with me on that. So we're still doing a lot of this mixing by hand, and it's not prilled. But you and I are working right now on a grow and bloom formula that would be prilled in a fertilizer that would be able to be available both in the U.S. and Canada, the same product, because I know your experience with logistics would allow us to get stuff down here. So I'm really excited for that, for people who don't want to necessarily, go with the soil or want to be able to add fertility throughout the growth cycle. So, I'm looking at targeting certain ratios with certain amendments based on the sustainability of those amendments and the NPK levels as well, and some of those things. And I'm really excited to go through this similar process we went with the soil. It might take a little while, but I know we'll get there. And I'm looking forward to that too.
Yeah, that's something that we get asked for all the time, and I think that comes out of some of the background of growers who are coming from a hydroponic past, and they're used to adding various different nutrients at different stages of growth and whatnot, so it's a product that the market certainly is used to using and is asking for. So it'd be nice if we can develop our own that meets those needs in the same way that the soil mix did.
Yeah. So one other thing I wanted to ask you is what, as someone who interacts with a ton of growers on a daily basis, what are the typical, sorts of like questions that you get asked or problems that you find growers come across the most?
Whew.
I know that's a really, really big question.
Yeah. We spend a tremendous amount of time answering questions and educating. Again, that just points to the comments I made in the earlier part of our conversation about kind of still it's an emerging market as such, and there's such a hunger out there on the part of growers for more and more information. Once you start going down this rabbit hole, I don't need to tell you, it gets pretty fascinating pretty quickly, and people come in here all the time with or emailing us all the time with questions. They're pretty broad ranging and pretty standard. I'd be hard pressed to really pick a question or two that stood out. I'd have to comment that the challenge, probably the main challenge that we face, is that person who has had a hydroponic background, who started off using bottled nutrients in some fashion, maybe a pro mix medium that they were growing in, and they discover the living soil option. They hear about it from a fellow grower or a friend, or they read about it and they get all excited about it, and get this real passion for wanting to try this out and come in and get what they need for the first grow and whatnot. And so they're leaping in with 1 foot into the living soil end of the pool, but they just can't seem to pull their hydroponic foot out of that end of the pool. So they hang on to understandings and belief systems that were relevant for using a cocoa or a pro mix with bottled nutrients and whatnot. But they don't; those assumptions don't necessarily carry over to a living soil. So just sort of pointing out to them why they don't need to worry about certain things anymore, and why they do need to consider other aspects, the differences between a soil approach. That probably is I'd have to say is the singular most challenging issue that we face on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I was thinking about it once I asked you myself, and I think that the two biggest things I come across are the challenge of watering correctly. I think that the watering relates so much to the health of the plant. I've talked about it with multiple guests, specifically the one with Don Marshall. If you listen to that podcast, I think that one is just a gem when it comes to talking about watering. So I'd suggest that for people. But the other question that the other challenge I find is that people do too much right off the gate. So they may switch to a living soil and then they start doing all these KNF inputs and, because a buddy told them those were good. And then they start doing, add this product from here and that product from there and all these different, secret sauces. And the next thing you know, you have this like conglomeration of inputs to where it's hard to know what was good and what was bad. So I don't want to discourage people from experimentation, but I'd say, start slow, maybe just start with water or do a couple beds with just water so you can get a baseline for how the soil performs. And then, if you want to do, some inputs or some teas or things, do them on half your plants or a portion of your facility that you're dedicating to R&D. But when you start doing everything all at once, it gets really chaotic and it makes it really hard to know what's going on. And then along those lines, if you were to say have a crop loss or fail for heavy metals, then you have the challenge of like that many more inputs and issues, and it's a nightmare.
Trying to narrow it down to what contributed to that is almost impossible. I couldn't agree more with you on that point, Ted, because just trying to, again, pointing at that enthusiasm and the passion that customers come in here with, and just trying to hold their feet on the ground sometimes is a bit of a challenge, because you're right. They want to try everything. They've read about 16 different items, and they got their budget, and they're going to buy 12 of them and throw them at their garden, sort of thing. And I say, well, hang on a sec here. I mean, how are you going to know which ones are really giving you the results or which ones are giving you the problems when you're throwing multiple options at your plants? I mean, that's very sound advice. Start with water only your first grow. Add something, maybe a little fish hydrolysate or whatever it is that you want to try, but try that on your second grow and realize that the only way you're going to become an experienced gardener, the only way you're really going to develop a set of gardening skills is by making mistakes, but also by really observing the impacts of these decisions that you're making on your soils and for your plants, and knowing that it was this particular product that had this particular impact, when I was using this particular set of genetics. There's so many variables, and throwing too much at your grow at any particular time is generally not going to have too much of a positive benefit.
Yeah, I'd say keep that money in your pocket, put it towards a par meter, a dyno light, some of these tools that may be really useful, a blue mat moisture meter, or some other way of measuring your moisture in your soil. Things that you're going to use grow after grow that are going to make you a better grower. But you do get this sort of mad scientist mentality where more is better, and you want to start fiddling. And you read about on this forum of people using this input and fermenting that product, and it gets a little out of control, I would say. Yeah, and just have fun at it. I mean, a lot of people are awfully driven by growing the biggest, dankest plant they possibly can, and that's great. That's fun. I mean, you look at the pumpkin guys who are constantly competing against each other for the biggest, bestest, but just have fun at it, and take the time to really observe what's going on in your garden. I think that's good advice for anybody. Definitely. Spend a little extra time in the garden is huge. It's going to make the biggest difference overall in your plant's health. You did mention genetics. I think that is something that gets overlooked too. Genetics are going to play one of the biggest roles overall in getting you that biggest, highest THC or highest cannabinoid plant. So I think that's something to highlight as well for folks. So yeah, I really enjoyed our conversation today, Rob. Is there anything you wanted to add before we sign off? No, I think that was fun. The only thing I'd like to add is that I have a tremendous appreciation for all of the help and support that you've provided over the short bit of time that we've known each other, and I'm looking forward to the next stage, because if there's one thing about gardening, you're never there. You never reach the finish line. It seems to move as far ahead as you make the effort to approach it, and you're always learning. It's a really exciting time to be looking down that rabbit hole of soil science with the environmental challenges that we have in our world today, and for food production, and yet still trying to mitigate the impact of our environmental degradation. There's a lot of really encouraging science that is pointing to the values of our soils and our plant interactions with them, and it's a way of exploring that, if nothing more than within a 16 square foot patch of your basement. It can be quite a rewarding approach. Yeah, well, I love what you guys are doing. I love having the ability to recommend the soil mix now for people that are in Canada and looking to try, living soils. I love that I've gotten to work with you guys, you and your son, throughout this process, and I look forward to formulating new products here in 2021. Great. That was Rob Knechtel with Black Swallow Living Soils, and you are listening to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. If you want to try out the KIS soil mix and you're in Canada, please reach out to Rob. We also have a nutrient pack available for Canada as well, which is the mineral nutrient portion of the mix, so you can source the bulkier inputs locally. And don't forget to check out the podcast page at www.kisorganics.com. Just click on the Learn tab and then Podcast. And if you want to support us or the podcast, please take a look at the variety of soil amendments, soils, lighting fixtures, and other growing products we offer on our website. We carefully research all the products we offer and manufacture to make sure they are all science-based and meet our standard of quality. Thanks for listening.